I'd like to look briefly with you at a few of the early questions that we find in the Summa Theology of St. Thomas Aquinas. Summa Theology is a compendium or collection of questions on theological and philosophical topics. It's very systematically arranged. There's a logic to it. What he does at the earliest questions in the Summa Theology is he wants to establish the subject matter that he's going to deal with in his great work. Aquinas does this because from Aristotle, he sort of follows Aristotle's approach to different sciences. For Aristotle, a science is a distinguishable area of learning, of knowledge, about which we can have some certainty of our conclusions. In order to have certainty of our conclusions, we first have to know what we are studying. So the most important thing to establish up front in any science or any certain knowledge that we have as human beings is to determine exactly what it is we're looking at. And for Aquinas, there are a certain number of sciences or areas of certain knowledge that we have as human beings. Just to quickly review, the first of those sciences, as also Aristotle is very clear about, is what he calls physics. So physics, for Aristotle and Aquinas, is a study of matter in motion. It's the study of moving things, moving bodies. And so if we study moving bodies, we can determine some of the principles by which such movement takes place, and out of that can emerge and develop a knowledge, a certainty of what it is that we are looking at when we see things changing or moving. The second of the sciences is mathematics. Math is that science which focuses on abstracted quantity and qualities from things. So for instance, arithmetic is a study of abstracting units or individuality or unity away from objects that you experience, and working with those units, logically deducing their conclusions and their implications. Same thing with geometry. In geometry, you take the shapes of things or the qualitative features of things, especially in regards to shape, and then you abstract those things from the objects that you're considering, and from that you're able to develop a science of such things or a certain knowledge of such things. Again, I know I'm rushing very quickly through those things, but this is essentially how Aristotle and Aquinas would define these things. The third of the science is what they call metaphysics. Metaphysics is a study of those things that transcend matter or that are not necessarily restricted to matter. This is the most abstract of these sciences, of these areas of knowing or learning and of reflection. The reason why it's the most abstract is because at this point we're dealing with the most fundamental principles of being, of reality. And those most fundamental principles transcend the limiting characteristics or the limiting properties or attributes of material things alone, and we're now talking about what are the principles of reality altogether. Again, those things are highly abstract that I'm talking about, and we'll be able to explore them a little bit more as we proceed. For Aristotle, metaphysics is a necessary science because physics is insufficient to account for its own motions. Aristotle famously developed an argument for the existence of God based on, or I should say, the discovery of the existence of God comes in Aristotle's work on physics, where at the conclusion of his reasoning he comes to the conclusion that moving things in this world require some type of first mover or some kind of ground of all motion, and that ground of all motion is studied and reflected upon in the study of metaphysics. Now for both Aristotle and Aquinas, these three sciences, and by the way, you could subcategorize these several sciences into various other categories. We could talk about all the different physical sciences underneath physics, but ultimately they all reduce to a study of changing beings, and therefore those subcategories underneath physics are in some sense or another derived from physics. And of course we could talk about all kinds of different subcategories within mathematics. But all of these, for both Aristotle and Aquinas, constitute an ascending order of scientific disciplines. And I should say that the word science here is being used in a sense a little bit different from the way we use it today. Science is being used in the sense of knowledge of something or certain knowledge of something. We tend to use the word science nowadays to refer specifically to the hard sciences, the empirical sciences. That's not the way that Aquinas and Aristotle use the word science. They use it more broadly so that it includes disciplines like mathematics, for example, which very rarely now would you hear mathematics referred to as a science, because we've come to use the word science very restrictively. But for Aristotle and Aquinas, the word science is more broad and includes any area about which human beings can have certain knowledge, and that we know what subject matter we're dealing with. We have specific principles that allow us to study that subject matter. And so these three sciences are for them an ascending order of scientific disciplines. They're ascending because we're getting higher and higher to more abstract or more remote from our sensory experience, more remote principles and levels of abstraction that we have to work with. Now for Aquinas, there is, not Aristotle, but for Aquinas there is still yet another science. It's what he calls sacred doctrine. Sacred doctrine, or theology, for Aquinas is the highest of all the sciences because it features God coming down to meet human beings in their quest for understanding. So as we're trying to move up to higher and higher levels of insight and knowledge, God comes down, according to Aquinas, God comes down to meet with us and to reveal himself. And I should say, to make Aquinas' point very clear, that if in fact God, the highest reality that is, at least in some indirect way, discovered in metaphysical reflection for us as human beings, if in fact God comes down to meet with human beings by revealing himself to us, then that would be the highest of all knowledge, because it is precisely the first principle itself, God in this case, God, the first principle of everything, is coming down to meet human beings and to reveal himself. And if that ever were to happen, Aquinas argues, I think quite reasonably, if in fact the God of all things comes down and reveals himself to human beings, then that would be the highest level of certitude and confidence that human beings could ever have, would be in what God has revealed to us. Now, of course, this raises many different questions, and we'll be able to consider some of those perhaps in the future. But for the moment, all I want to point out is that Aquinas, at the beginning of the Summa Theology, sets forth this idea that sacred doctrine is the highest of all the sciences. Now, it presupposes, though, sacred doctrine presupposes the existence of God. If God does not exist, then obviously the idea of sacred theology is nonsense. How could there be a revelation from God? How could there be some type of way in which God makes himself known if in fact there is no God at all? So Aquinas thinks that the first thing that he needs to make known, or the first thing that he needs to emphasize, and that he needs to demonstrate or to show, is that God in fact exists. If God exists, then we can begin to discover what God is like, or what God has revealed to us as human beings. So the first big question for Aquinas is this one: does God exist? Now let me get rid of this, and we're going to look at one of the early questions of the Summa Theology very briefly. The first question that I'd like to look at, I've indicated at the top of the board, which is by ST, I simply abbreviate Summa Theology, and we're talking about the first part of the Summa, which is indicated by the Roman numeral 1, and then the question 2, and then article 1. The title of the article is whether the existence of God is self-evident. Is the existence of God self-evident? Now, the Latin phrase that's translated as self-evident here is per se notum. The question is the existence of God per se notum? That is it known directly and immediately? Do we know it by encountering it in a direct way? Or, on the other hand, is the existence of God something that is mediated to us, or we discover it through something else? Now, let's look at an example of this in the text, and I'm looking here at the Summa Theology, the first part, the second question, Article 1. For my students, this would be in the Summa of the Summa, page 54, where you see the actual text. And I want to look at the second objection that Aquinas raises to his position on this question. As you may know by looking at various questions that Aquinas poses in his work, and the Summa Theology is made up of thousands of questions, by looking at those various questions that he raises, you see that he typically begins with a series of objections to the position that he's going to take. And then he responds to those objections first by laying out his own principles, or the ideas that he's going to use in order to respond to the question. And then finally he will have a response to the objections. So what he does here is, in response to the question whether the existence of God is self-evident, and I hope you see the implications of the question. If the answer is yes, the existence of God is self-evident, then we need no argument for God's existence. We need no reason for God's existence because we already know it. We already have direct experience of God, and there's no need to establish God's existence through some type of reasoning process or argument. So what Aquinas does here is he's taking up a question that's very, very significant and important for what we are obligated to do, especially if we're going to have a theological science or something about which we can have certitude or confidence about. So I want to look at the second objection because I think it's the most interesting one. It's the longest one. There's overlap between the three objections that Aquinas offers to his position. But let's take a look at the second objection. He says, further, those things or propositions are said to be self-evident, which are known to be true as soon as the terms are known, which the philosopher, which we know as Aristotle, says is true of the first principles of demonstration. Thus, when the nature of a whole and of a part is known, it is at once recognized that every whole is greater than its part. Now let me try to explain what he means so far. He takes this statement, the whole is greater than the part. The whole is greater than the part. In this statement, we see that the subject of the statement is the whole, and we're defining it or we're explaining it as being greater than the part. So the predicate of the sentence, that would be this part, is greater than the part, and the subject, of course, is whole. The predicate of the sentence is simply, Aquinas would say, unfolding or unpacking what's already implied in the subject. The subject is the whole. Now the definition of a whole is the sum total of parts. So by definition, the whole is greater than the part. If we know what the word whole means, we know that this proposition or this statement must be true. There are other propositions that we can't know that they're true just by looking at the predicate and the subject and knowing that the predicate is unfolding what's in the subject. For example, if we take the statement, the car is red. The car is red. The predicate is red. Do we know just by looking at the word car or by knowing what a car is, do we know that it must be red or that it is red? The answer, of course, is no. We can't know just by thinking car that the car is red. It's potentially red, but it's also potentially blue or black or white or whatever. So the statement, the car is red, is not a self-evidently true proposition. We have to have some experience to help us know whether or not that statement is true. With respect to this statement, the whole is greater than the part, we know that it must be true just by knowing the definition of the word. So what Aquinas is asking here is the existence of God like the first statement, that we know that it's true just by knowing what the word God means, or rather, is the existence of God something like this second statement, God exists, is something that must be demonstrated or must be discovered to be true through other considerations rather than simply thinking about what the word God means. So that's the question that he's raising here. He goes on in the objection, and remember in the objection Aquinas is not defending his own position. He's not saying that this is what I defend, he's saying this is an argument that's brought against my own position. He goes on to say, but as soon as the signification of the word God is understood, it is at once seen that God exists. For by this word is signified that thing than which nothing greater can be conceived. But that which exists actually and mentally is greater than that which exists only mentally. Therefore, since as soon as the word God is understood it exists mentally, it also follows that it exists actually. Therefore, the proposition God exists is self-evident. Now, I don't have time in this presentation to explain what he means by this, but let me just say in conclusion that what Aquinas is doing here is summarizing a very famous argument from St. Anselm of Canterbury, who lived in the 11th century A.D., and he presented an argument that is supposed to be an argument showing or demonstrating the existence of God simply by reflecting on the word God. In the next presentation, I'd like to explain a little bit about that argument and then how Aquinas proceeds with this question.